"Your brother's not broke like you," my dad said at dinner. "He's independent. Don't rely on anyone." Everyone laughed. I lifted my glass. I said nothing. But the next morning, I called the bank. It took less than 2 minutes. 3 days later, Dad called over 100 times. His voice was shaking. His face was pale with panic. That's when I knew you don't need to argue with people who live off your silence. To understand why that phone call mattered, you need to know how that dinner really felt. It was a Thursday evening in late October. I had driven 40 minutes from my apartment in Hoboken to my parents' house in suburban New Jersey, the same house I grew up in, the same house whose mortgage I had been quietly paying for 6 years. I pulled into the driveway behind Daniel's car, a newer model than mine despite the fact that he hadn't held a steady job in 3 years. I didn't let myself think about that. I grabbed the bottle of wine from the passenger seat and walked inside. The house smelled like roast chicken and something sweet baking. My mother had set the table with the good dishes, the ones she saved for when Daniel visited. I noticed that detail without meaning to. When it was just me coming for dinner, we ate in the kitchen. Daniel was already holding court at the table, leaned back in his chair, gesturing with his hands as he described some photography project he was pitching to a gallery in Brooklyn. He had quit his marketing job 3 years ago to pursue his passion. The passion shifted every 18 months or so. First it was photography, then documentary filmmaking, then back to photography, but artistic this time. Conceptual, whatever that meant. My parents listened like he was delivering a TED Talk. My mother refilled his wine glass before he asked. My father nodded along, eyes bright, asking follow-up questions that assumed momentum and success. "When's the show? Have you talked to that gallery owner again? What's your vision for the series?" I set the wine on the counter and took my seat. No one looked up. I unfolded my napkin and placed it on my lap. Waited. Eventually, my mother glanced my way. "Everything good?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Everything's good." That was my line. It had always been my line. I was the child who didn't need follow-up questions, the one who handled things quietly, who never created problems, who showed up on time with a bottle of wine and left without anyone noticing exactly when. Dinner moved in its usual rhythm. Daniel talked about his artistic vision. My parents asked about his plans, his projects, and his future. Questions that assumed he was going somewhere. Questions that implied investment in his trajectory. I ate my chicken. I nodded when appropriate. I had long ago learned how to exist comfortably in the background of my own family. I should tell you what I actually do for a living since no one at that table ever asked. I'm a partner at a mid-size accounting firm in Manhattan. I became a partner 2 years ago, the youngest in the firm's history. I manage a team of 12. I handle accounts worth more than my parents' house. None of this had ever come up at a family dinner. When I mentioned my promotion 2 years ago, my mother said, "That's nice, honey," and then asked Daniel about his latest creative project. So when my father made the comment about Daniel not being broke like me, it didn't land like a bomb. It landed like a period at the end of a sentence everyone had already agreed on. It fit so easily into the story, they all believed that no one even flinched. "Daniel's really figured it out," my dad continued. "Independent, doesn't need anyone's help. That's the way to do it." My mother smiled proudly at Daniel. Daniel shrugged with practiced modesty. And I sat there holding my wine glass doing the math in my head. $3,000 a month, 72 payments, $216,000. That's how much I had quietly transferred to my parents' account over the past 6 years to cover their mortgage. That's how much independence had cost me. They didn't know, or rather, they had decided not to know. My father had called 6 years ago about a timing issue. The mortgage was short by $3,000 that month. Just a gap, he said. Just temporary. I set up an automatic transfer that same week and never mentioned it again. Neither did they. The money appeared in their account every month like magic, and no one ever asked where it came from. Somewhere along the way, the story had shifted. In their minds, the financial pressure had lifted. Things had stabilized. And since Daniel was the one who talked about money with confidence, who spoke about investments and opportunities and future plans, he had become the one who was handling things. The fact that he had never transferred a single dollar to their account was irrelevant. The narrative was more comfortable than the truth. I raised my glass when my father made his joke. I smiled. I said nothing. That was the role I had always played. The quiet one, the easy one. The one who absorbed and accommodated and never made anyone uncomfortable with reality. After dinner, I cleared the dishes. My mother thanked me absently while listening to something Daniel was saying about gallery representation. My father poured another drink. When I put on my coat to leave, no one noticed for several minutes. The drive home was quiet. I didn't replay the comment or rehearse the things I should have said. What stayed with me was something simpler and colder clarity. This wasn't about one sentence at dinner. This was about 6 years of invisible support, 6 years of writing checks while someone else took credit, 6 years of being erased from a story I was literally funding. I went to bed that night and slept fine. I woke up at my usual time, made coffee, and sat down at my laptop. I wasn't angry. I wasn't shaking with rage or plotting revenge. I just felt finished. The way you feel when you've been carrying something heavy for so long that your arms have gone numb and you finally realize you can just set it down. I logged into my bank account and navigated to the automatic transfers. The entry was right there, familiar and routine. $3,000 scheduled for the first of every month destination, my parents' checking account. I had set it up 6 years ago and never looked at it closely since. It just ran in the background, invisible assumed. I clicked cancel. The system asked me to confirm. I confirmed. It took less than 2 minutes. 6 years of silent support ended with 2 clicks and a confirmation screen. I closed my laptop and finished my coffee. The morning light coming through my window looked exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. Nothing had visibly changed, but I knew what was coming. The mortgage payment was due on the 5th. I had canceled the transfer on the 2nd. By the 4th, the bank would flag the shortfall. And my father, who hadn't had $3,000 in his account for 6 years, would discover that the safety net he never acknowledged had just disappeared. My phone started ringing on the 3rd day. First one call, then several, then dozens. By the time my father's name had appeared on my screen for the 100th time, I understood something I should have understood years ago. They had never noticed what I gave them. They only noticed when I stopped. When he finally showed up at my door, the man who had laughed loudest at dinner stood in my hallway with pale skin and panic in his eyes. He couldn't even form a complete sentence. He just kept saying, "The bank called. There's a problem. Something's wrong with the payment." I looked at him standing there, desperate and confused, and I felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph, not satisfied, just recognition. He was finally seeing me. It only took threatening to let him fall. People think silence means weakness. In my family, silence meant survival. It was a skill I learned before I understood I was learning it, absorbed through years of watching and adapting and figuring out which version of myself caused the least friction. I was an easy child. That's how they described me, always with a note of relief. She's so easy. Never ask for anything. Handles everything herself. I heard it so many times that I built an identity around it. Being easy meant being good. Being easy meant being loved, or at least being left alone, which sometimes felt like the same thing. Daniel was different. Daniel was allowed to struggle out loud. When he failed a class in high school, it was a learning experience. When he maxed out a credit card in his 20s, it was a phase. When he quit stable jobs to chase creative dreams that never materialized, it was following his passion. His mistakes were always framed as growth. His needs were always framed as valid. I remember Thanksgiving when Daniel announced he was leaving his marketing job to become a photographer full-time. He had no clients, no savings, no real plan. My mother put her hand over her heart, like he'd just announced he was curing cancer. "That's so brave," she said. "You have to follow your dreams." My father nodded thoughtfully and said something about how you only live once. 2 years before that, I had mentioned at dinner that I was considering leaving my accounting firm to join a startup. The opportunity was real. The numbers were solid. I had done the research. My father had looked at me like I'd suggested lighting money on fire. "You're the stable one," he said. "Don't be reckless." My mother had frowned and asked if I was feeling okay. The subject was dropped, and I stayed at my firm. 2 years later, I made a partner. No one threw me a Thanksgiving announcement moment. I'm not telling you this because I want your pity. I'm telling you because it explains why when my father called 6 years ago about the mortgage, I said yes without hesitation, and why I never told anyone, and why I kept paying long after it stopped feeling temporary. The first call came on a Tuesday evening. I was still at the office finishing a client report. My father's voice was calm, almost casual. "We've got a timing issue with the mortgage this month. Just a gap, $3,000 short. We'll have it sorted by next month." He didn't ask. He explained. In my family, that was how requests worked when they came from him. He presented the situation, and I was expected to understand my role in solving it. I did understand. I had always understood. So I said, "I can cover it. I'll set up a transfer." "Just this month," he said. "We'll get it sorted." I set up the automatic transfer that same week. $3,000 on the first of every month. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself I was helping my parents through a rough patch. I told myself that family takes care of family, and this was what that looked like. 1 month became 3. 3 became 12. 12 became 72. The transfer ran like clockwork, invisible and assumed. No one asked me how long I planned to continue. No one offered updates on when they might take over. No one said thank you, except occasionally my mother would mention something vague about being glad things were more stable now. But here's the part that mattered. They didn't know it was me. Or rather, they knew at some point it had been me, and then they forgot, and then they rewrote the story to make themselves more comfortable. I realized this slowly through small comments that accumulated over years. My father mentioned that we're in a good place financially now. My mother talked about how nice it was not to worry about money anymore. And then, increasingly, references to Daniel stepping up and being responsible. I don't know exactly when Daniel became the family's financial hero. I don't know if my parents genuinely believed he was contributing, or if they just needed to believe it, or if the truth was simply too uncomfortable to examine. What I know is that by the time my father made that comment at dinner about Daniel being independent, the story had been completely rewritten. I wasn't even a footnote. $216,000 gone from my accounts, absorbed into their mortgage, and the official family narrative was that Daniel had things handled. I could have corrected them. I could have shown them bank statements pointed to dates and amounts and forced them to acknowledge reality. But I knew how that would play out. In my family, explaining your contribution was the same as bragging. Asking for credit was the same as keeping score. If I spoke up, I wouldn't be the generous daughter who had quietly saved their house. I would be the difficult one who couldn't let things go. So I stayed quiet. And my silence allowed their story to harden into fact. That's the thing about silence. People think it's neutral. They think it's just the absence of noise. But silence takes sides. Every time I didn't correct them, I agreed with their version. Every time I absorbed an insult without responding, I confirmed that the insult was acceptable. My silence didn't protect me. It protected them from having to see me. I understood this fully in the weeks after that dinner when I started paying attention to the story my family was telling. I listened to how they talked about money, about responsibility, about who was contributing what. I noticed how often my name was absent from those conversations. I noticed how easily Daniel's imaginary contributions had replaced my real ones. And I asked myself a question that had never occurred to me before. If I stopped paying, tomorrow would anyone even notice it was me who stopped? The answer, when my father showed up at my door 3 days after I canceled the transfer, was clear. He didn't say, "Why did you stop helping us?" He said, "Something's wrong with the payment." Like the money had been coming from a machine, and the machine had malfunctioned. He didn't see me as the source. He saw me as the technician who was supposed to fix it. That was the moment I understood that my silence had erased me. Not just from the story they told each other, but from their actual perception of reality. I had made myself so invisible, so easy, so quiet, that I had disappeared completely. And the only way to become visible again was to let them fall. The calls started on the 4th day. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. My phone lit up so constantly that I eventually turned it face down on my kitchen counter just to eat breakfast in peace. My father's voicemails evolved in stages. First came confusion. "There's been some kind of mix-up with the bank. Call me back." Then irritation. I need you to call the bank and sort this out. Something's wrong with the transfer. Then finally panic. The mortgage is due tomorrow. I don't understand what's happening. Call me. Now. He still didn't understand. Even with the deadline looming, even with the bank sending warnings, he couldn't connect the dots. He thought there had been a technical error. He thought the money had failed to transfer by accident. It never occurred to him that I had chosen to stop. When I finally answered his call, his voice was high and strained. "What happened with the payment?" he demanded. "Did something go wrong with your account?" "Nothing went wrong," I said. "I canceled the auto pay." "What do you mean you canceled it?" "I mean I stopped paying your mortgage, Dad. I've been paying for it for 6 years. I decided to stop." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. I counted. "That's not right," he said finally. "We thought Daniel was helping with that. Daniel has never transferred a single dollar to your account. I can show you the records." "But he said he was handling things." "He wasn't. I was. For 6 years. And now I'm not." I could hear him breathing, trying to rearrange reality into something that made sense. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from confusion to something harder. "You need to fix this. The payment is due tomorrow." "I'm not fixing it." "What do you mean you're not fixing it? We could lose the house." "Then I suggest you figure something out." He exploded, not with apologies or understanding or any acknowledgement of what I had done for them. He exploded with accusations. I was being selfish. I was being cruel. I was punishing them for no reason. I was destroying the family over some petty grudge. He demanded I restore the payment immediately. He told me I had no right to do this to them. He invoked every guilt trip in the family playbook. "After everything we've done for you, we raised you. Family doesn't turn their back on family." I listened without interrupting. When he finally ran out of steam, I said, "You called me broke at dinner. In front of everyone, and you meant it. You actually believe Daniel is the successful one and I'm struggling." "That was just a joke." "It wasn't a joke to you, it was the truth as you understand it. And the truth as you understand it is based on a story that I've been funding for 6 years without any of you knowing or caring. So this is about revenge. You're going to let us lose our house because of one comment." "No," I said. "I'm going to let you handle your own mortgage because it's your mortgage. The help I gave was never acknowledged. The money I sent was attributed to someone else. The least I can do is stop subsidizing a story that erases me." He hung up on me. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat by the window watching the morning light shift across my apartment floor. My mother called an hour later. Her approach was different, but aimed at the same target. She cried. She talked about how stressed everyone was, how scary this situation was, how she couldn't sleep. She reminded me of my childhood, of sacrifices she'd made, of everything they'd done to give me a good life. "I don't understand why you would do this to us," she said through tears. "I thought we were family." "We are family," I said. "And for 6 years I showed that by paying your mortgage without being asked, without being thanked, and without being acknowledged. I'm not the one who broke the family contract here." "You could have told us. You could have said something. Would it have mattered?" She didn't answer. We both knew the truth. If I had spoken up, I would have been told I was keeping score. I would have been accused of throwing my contributions in their faces. The family narrative required my silence, and I had provided it for years. "Please," she said, "just help us get through this month. We'll figure out the rest." "You'll figure it out," I said. "I have faith in you." Daniel called that evening. His tone was careful, measured the voice of someone trying to manage a situation without committing to a position. "So Dad says there's some issue with the mortgage." "There's no issue. I stopped paying it." "You were paying for it." The surprise in his voice was genuine. He actually didn't know. All those years of being credited with handling things, and he had never once questioned where the money was coming from. 6 years, I said. $3,000 a month. $216,000 total. I didn't know it was that much. I thought Mom and Dad had it covered. They said things were stable. Things were stable because I was making them stable. You just got the credit for it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you never said anything. No, I didn't. So how was I supposed to know? You weren't, That's the point. Nobody was supposed to know. I was supposed to be invisible. I was supposed to solve the problem without anyone having to acknowledge there was a problem. That's my role in this family, the quiet one who handles things. Look, I get that you're upset, but we need to focus on fixing this right now. Can we figure out a solution? I have a solution. You handle it. You've been telling everyone you're handling things for years. Now you can actually handle them. I can't come up with $3,000 by tomorrow. Then I suggest you start making calls. He didn't have anything to say to that. After a long pause, he muttered something about talking to Dad and hung up. I sat in my apartment as the evening light faded into darkness. My phone buzzed with more messages, more calls, more voicemails. I didn't answer any of them. For the first time in 6 years, the silence was mine. I had chosen it. I was holding it. And I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I felt like I existed, Panic has a short lifespan. It burns hot and fast, and when it fades, something colder takes its place. By the end of the first week, my family had stopped screaming and started strategizing. The calls became less frequent but more pointed. The voicemails became shorter, more careful, as if someone had advised them to watch what they said. And the questions changed from, "Why are you doing this?" to, "What do you want?" I suggested we all get on a call together, my parents, Daniel, and me. Everyone hears the same information at the same time. I could feel their reluctance through the phone. A joint call meant no one could tell a different story. It meant facts would have to be agreed upon. We scheduled it for Saturday afternoon. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, bank statements loaded, timeline prepared. When everyone joined the call, the tension was immediate. "I want to start by clarifying what actually happened," I said. "For the past 6 years, I have been transferring $3,000 a month into Mom and Dad's account. This money covered the mortgage shortfall. The total amount transferred was $216,000. I have bank statements confirming every payment." "That can't be right," my mother said. "I thought it was just occasional help." "It was monthly, automatic, every first of the month for 72 consecutive months." My father jumped in. "Daniel said he was helping us out." I looked at my screen. "Daniel, have you ever transferred money to Mom and Dad's account?" There was a pause. Then Daniel said, "I've helped out here and there." "Do you have records of those transfers, dates, amounts?" Another pause, longer this time. "I'd have to look." "I have my records right here. Every payment is documented. If you have records showing your contributions, we can compare them." He didn't respond. We all knew what that meant. There were no records because there were no payments. The independence my parents bragged about existed only in their imagination. "I don't understand," my mother said, her voice trembling. "If you were paying all along, why didn't you say something? Because saying something would have made me the problem. You would have told me I was keeping score. You would have accused me of throwing it in your face. The family rule is that we don't talk about who does what. We just assume it gets handled. Well, I handled it for 6 years, and I'm done." "So this is punishment," my father said. "You're punishing us for not reading your mind." "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm stepping back from a role I never agreed to play permanently. You needed help 6 years ago. I gave it. You never asked how long I could keep giving it. You never checked to see if I was okay. You just assumed the money would keep appearing, and then you gave Daniel credit for it." "We didn't know," my mother said. "You didn't want to know. There's a difference." My father's voice hardened. "What do you want an apology? You want us to grovel. I want you to handle your own mortgage. I want you to stop telling people that Daniel is the responsible one while I'm broke. And I want to stop being invisible in my own family." "You're being dramatic." $216,000, Dad. That's not dramatic. That's math." The call ended without resolution. I hadn't expected one. What I'd expected was exactly what happened, each of them retreating to the version of reality that made them most comfortable. My mother would tell herself she simply didn't know. My father would tell himself I was being vindictive, and Daniel would tell himself it wasn't his fault, that everyone assumed things about him that weren't true. Over the following days, the family narrative began its revision. I could track it through conversations with relatives who suddenly reached out with concern, Cousins I hadn't talked to in years texted me asking if everything was okay. My aunt, my father's sister, called to tell me she'd heard I was having some kind of breakdown. "Your parents are devastated," she said. "Daniel's trying to hold everything together. I don't understand why you would abandon them like this. Did they tell you that I've been paying their mortgage for 6 years?" A pause. "They mentioned you helped out occasionally, but Daniel's been doing most of the heavy lifting." "Daniel has never contributed $1. I have bank statements." "Well, that's between you and them, but family is family. You don't turn your back when things get hard." "Aunt Barbara, I've been carrying them financially since I was 31. I'm 37 now. When does my obligation end?" She didn't have an answer. She just repeated that family is family and that she hoped I would do the right thing. I was beginning to understand how the story would be told. In their version, I was the villain, the successful daughter who had abandoned her struggling parents over a misunderstanding, the bitter sister who couldn't handle her brother getting some credit. They would sand down the edges of reality until it fit comfortably into a narrative where they were the victims and I was the problem. I could fight that narrative. I could send bank statements to every relative who called. I could post receipts on Facebook. I could make a scene at the next family gathering. But I knew it wouldn't matter. People believe what they want to believe. Facts don't change stories. They just get absorbed into them. So I didn't fight. I let them tell their version. I focused on one thing only: I would not pay another $1. Whatever story they told about me, the money was done. By the end of the month, my parents had scrambled together enough to cover the mortgage. I didn't ask how. A loan from somewhere, equity from something, promises made to someone. They survived. But the crisis had revealed something that couldn't be unrevealed. When they were desperate, they called me. Not Daniel, not their independent success story. Me, the broken one, the quiet one. The one who, when you actually needed something, had always come through. They knew now. Even if they never admitted it out loud, they knew who had been holding them up all along. The shift happened slowly then, all at once. One week my family was panicking and pleading. Next they were calculating. I noticed it first in the language. The calls stopped being about the mortgage and started being about me, about my choices, about my mental state, about what I might do next. "We're worried about you," my mother said in a voicemail. "You haven't seemed like yourself lately. Maybe you should talk to someone." This from a woman who had never once asked how I was doing when I was actually struggling. Now suddenly my mental health was a concern. My father's approach was more direct. "You need to think about how this looks," he said in one of his messages. "People are going to ask questions. This could affect your career, your reputation. Think about what you're doing." I understood what was happening. They had moved from defense to offense. If I was crazy or unstable or having some kind of episode, then my actions didn't need to be taken seriously. My grievances could be dismissed. The story of the selfish daughter became the story of the unwell daughter, which was somehow more sympathetic for them. My Aunt Barbara called again. "Your mother is really worried about you. She thinks maybe you're under too much stress at work. Have you considered taking some time off?" "I'm fine. I'm actually better than I've been in years." "That's what worries her. You're not acting like yourself." "You mean I'm not acting like the quiet one who goes along with everything?" "I mean, you're not acting like family." Messages started arriving through channels I hadn't expected. A cousin I was barely close to sent me a Facebook message. "Heard you're going through some stuff. Here if you need to talk." My college roommate, who I hadn't spoken to in a decade, suddenly reached out because she'd run into my mom at the grocery store and she seemed concerned. They were building a case, not a legal case, a social case, a consensus. Getting people on record saying I seemed off seemed different, seemed unlike myself. So that later, when the story was fully formed, there would be witnesses to my instability. I started documenting everything: dates, times, exact wording. I saved voicemails and screenshots of texts, not because I planned to do anything with them, but because I needed an accurate record. When you're being slowly gaslit, having evidence of what actually happened is the only way to trust your own memory. One afternoon, my mother showed up at my apartment without calling first. I was working from home, still in my pajamas at 2 p.m., because I'd had a late night with a client deadline. She looked at me like my appearance confirmed every suspicion. "You look terrible," she said. "When did you last shower?" "I showered this morning. What are you doing here?" "I was in the area. I thought we could talk." "You live 40 minutes away. You weren't in the area." She pushed past me into the apartment, scanning the room like she was looking for evidence. Dishes in the sink, laundry basket in the corner, normal stuff for someone who works 60 hours a week, but she was seeing what she wanted to see. "We're worried about you," she said. "Your father and I, Daniel too, we think maybe you need some help." "I don't need help. I need boundaries. This isn't like you. The person I raised wouldn't abandon her family. The person you raised paid your mortgage for 6 years without a single thank you. Maybe you don't know who you raised as well as you think you do." She sat down on my couch without asking. "We want to have a real conversation, a family meeting, with a mediator, someone neutral." "Who would this neutral mediator be?" "Pastor Williams said he'd be willing to sit down with us." I almost laughed. Pastor Williams was my parents' pastor. He'd known them for 30 years. He'd baptized Daniel. He'd barely met me because I stopped going to church when I left for college. "That's not a neutral party. That's your ally." "He's a man of God. He doesn't take sides." "He'll take your side because he only knows your side." "No." Her expression hardened. "You're being difficult." "I'm being accurate. You don't want mediation. You want someone to tell me I'm wrong and pressure me to start paying again." "Fine," she said, standing up. "If you won't even try to work this out, then I don't know what to do. I don't know who you are anymore." She left without saying goodbye. I locked the door behind her and leaned against it, heart pounding. This was new. They weren't just hurt anymore. They were strategizing, and I was the obstacle they needed to manage. That night I called a lawyer, not to sue anyone but to understand my options. I'd never thought of my family as adversaries before, but the way they were moving, the way they were building a narrative, felt like preparation for something. I didn't know what, but I wanted to be ready. The lawyer's name was Patricia. Her office was in a strip mall in Jersey City, nothing fancy. She listened to my story without interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions, and then laid it out simply. "There's no legal obligation here. You gave them money voluntarily. You can stop any time. They have no grounds to sue you for support." "What about the other stuff, showing up at my apartment, calling my friends?" "Annoying, but not illegal. If it escalates to harassment, you'd have options. But right now it's just aggressive family behavior." "What do I do?" "Document everything. Keep records. Don't delete messages. If they show up uninvited again, don't let them in, and note the date and time. If anyone contacts you claiming to be concerned because your family told them to be save that message too." "You think it could escalate?" "I think people protect their interests. Right now, they're trying to pressure you back into compliance using social channels. If that doesn't work, they might try other angles. Financial claims, defamation, accusations designed to damage you professionally. I'm not saying they will, but I've seen families do ugly things when money is involved." I paid her $400 for that consultation. It was worth every cent. I walked out of her office feeling something I hadn't felt in weeks prepared. They wanted to build a case that I was unstable. Fine, I would build a record of exactly who did what, when, and how. If this turned into a war, I would have ammunition. And unlike their narrative about my mental health, mine would be based on facts. I should have known better than to trust Maya. But she was the only person in Daniel's orbit who had ever seemed to see through the family performance. At holiday gatherings, while my parents fawned over Daniel's latest project, Maya would catch my eye and smirk just slightly. She didn't add to the chorus of praise. She didn't pretend Daniel was more impressive than he was. I mistook that for solidarity. We had bonded over small moments of shared skepticism. The Thanksgiving, when Daniel announced his documentary film idea and my father called it visionary, Maya leaned over and whispered, "Visionary is a strong word for someone who hasn't finished anything in 3 years." I had almost choked on my wine. It was the first time anyone in that house had acknowledged what I saw so clearly. After that, I thought of her as an ally, someone who existed inside the family system but wasn't fooled by it. After the confrontation with my parents, I needed someone to talk to. Not for advice necessarily, just to hear myself think out loud. The weight of what was happening felt unbearable when I carried it alone. Maya and I had gotten coffee a few times over the years, always at her suggestion, always with the unspoken understanding that we were both outsiders in different ways. She was an accountant too, which gave us professional common ground. She understood numbers. She understood the documentation. I thought she might understand mine. I texted her on a Wednesday afternoon. "Can we meet? I need to talk to someone who isn't going to tell me I'm crazy." She responded within minutes. "Of course. Café Luna tomorrow, 2 p.m. Café Luna was in Montclair, halfway between her house and my apartment. Neutral territory. I arrived first and ordered a coffee I didn't really want. When Maya walked in, she looked genuinely concerned. She hugged me, which she'd never done before. That should have been my first warning. Concern can be a form of reconnaissance. We sat in a corner booth away from other customers. She waited for me to start. "Things have gotten bad," I said. "Really bad. I heard there was some kind of financial issue. Daniel mentioned something about the mortgage. Did he tell you what the financial issue actually was? He said there was a mix-up with payments, that you were upset about something." I almost laughed. A mix-up. That was how they were framing it now, not 6 years of silent support, not $200,000, a mix-up. "Let me tell you what actually happened," I said, and I did. All of it. The original phone call from my father 6 years ago. The autopay I set up and never mentioned. The monthly transfers that became invisible infrastructure. The dinner comment about Daniel being independent while I was broke. The moment I decided to stop. The panic, the accusations, the rewriting of reality. Maya listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold in front of her. When I finished, her eyes were wide. "That's insane," she said. $200,000? $216,000. I have the records." And they just pretended Daniel was paying for it. They convinced themselves. I don't think they were deliberately lying. They just let the story become what they wanted it to be. Daniel talks about money with confidence, so they assumed he was handling it. I never talked about it at all, so I became invisible. God. She shook her head slowly. I mean, I knew Daniel wasn't exactly a financial powerhouse. He talks a big game, but I do our taxes. I know what comes in and what goes out. But I didn't know you were carrying them this whole time. It felt good to be believed, to have someone validate that the situation was as absurd as it seemed. For weeks, I had been questioning myself, wondering if I was overreacting, if I was being cruel. Hearing Maya's shock made me feel less insane. "So, what are they saying now?" she asked. "How are they explaining all this?" "They're not explaining it, they're reframing it. My mom showed up at my apartment last week to check if I was mentally stable. My aunt is calling people I barely know to ask if I seem okay. They're building a narrative that I've lost my mind." "That's ridiculous. You're the most stable person I know." "Stable people don't stop paying their parents' mortgage without warning, apparently. Stable people don't have boundaries. Stable people just keep giving until there's nothing left." Maya reached across the table and touched my hand. "What are you going to do?" I hesitated. This was the moment I should have stopped. I should have said I didn't know. I should have kept my plans to myself. But I was tired of carrying everything alone, and Maya had just validated everything I'd been feeling. I wanted to trust her. I needed to trust someone. "I talked to a lawyer," I said. "Not to sue anyone, just to understand my options. To know where I stand legally if things escalate." "That's smart. What did they say?" "That I have no obligation to keep paying. That the money I gave was voluntary, so they can't claim I owe them anything. But she also said I should document everything. The calls, the messages, my mom showing up uninvited. Just in case things get worse." "You're documenting everything. Every voicemail, every text, every conversation I can remember with dates and details. If they try to say I'm unstable or that I did something wrong, I want a record of what actually happened." Maya nodded slowly. "That's really smart. Protect yourself. You never know how far people will go when money is involved." That's what the lawyer said. We talked for another hour about the family dynamics, about Daniel's pattern of taking credit for things he didn't do, about my parents' favoritism and how it had shaped both of us in different ways. Maya shared her own frustrations, how she sometimes felt like she'd married into a family that saw her as an accessory to Daniel's life rather than a person in her own right. By the time we left, I felt lighter than I had in weeks. "Thank you for listening," I said in the parking lot. "I needed this. Anytime. And seriously, if you need anything, let me know. I'm on your side." I believed her. That was my mistake. 2 weeks later, I got a text from my father. The message was short, but it landed like a punch to the chest. "I hear you're building a case against us. That's a new low even for you." Building a case against us. I stared at the message for a long time, reading it over and over. Those words, building a case. I had never used that phrase, but I had said something close. I had told Maya I was documenting everything just in case. In the retelling that became building a case, documenting for self-protection became preparing a legal attack. My reasonable precaution became evidence of my hostility. The only person I had told was Maya. I called her that evening. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I had learned how to keep my voice steady. "Did you tell Daniel about our conversation?" There was a pause, a long pause, the kind of pause that contains an entire confession. "I mentioned some things," she said finally. "What things?" "He was asking about you. He wanted to know why you were being so hostile, why you wouldn't talk to anyone. I was trying to help him understand." "What exactly did you tell him, Maya?" Another pause. "Just that you felt unappreciated, that the mortgage thing had really hurt you, that you'd talked to a lawyer and you were keeping records of everything." The room felt like it was tilting. "Why would you tell him that? Everyone was so upset. Your parents were panicking. Daniel didn't know what to do. I thought if he understood where you were coming from, maybe he could help smooth things over. Maybe he could talk to your parents and make them see your side." "That's not your information to share." I was trying to help. Things were spiraling out of control. I thought if they knew you were serious, if they knew you had a lawyer, they might take you more seriously. They might actually listen. They didn't take me more seriously. They added, "She's building a legal case against her own family" to the list of reasons I'm crazy. You handed them exactly what they needed to make me look like the villain. Maya's voice shifted, becoming defensive. I didn't know they would twist it like that. I thought they would hear it and realize they needed to apologize, to make things right. "You've met my family, Maya. When have they ever responded to anything by apologizing? Silence. You gave them ammunition," I continued. "You took something I told you in confidence, something I shared because I thought you were safe, and you handed it to people who are actively trying to undermine me. Do you understand what you did? I think you're being paranoid. They're your family. They're not trying to undermine you. They're just scared and confused." My mother showed up at my apartment to assess my mental state. "My aunt is calling people I haven't talked to in a decade to ask if I seem okay. They're not scared and confused. They're building a case that I've lost my mind. And you just gave them their best piece of evidence. She hired a lawyer. She's documenting everything. She's preparing to attack us." That's how they're going to tell it. That's how they're probably already telling it. The silence stretched between us. When Maya finally spoke, her voice was smaller. "I'm sorry. I really was trying to help. I didn't think—" "No, you didn't think so. Or you thought about what Daniel needed more than what I needed. Either way, the result is the same." "What can I do? How can I fix this?" "You can't. The information is out there. It's already part of their story. All you can do now is stop talking about me to anyone." "I won't say anything else, I promise. Don't contact me again." I hung up before she could respond. I sat in my apartment as darkness fell, processing what had happened. The betrayal was clean and complete, almost elegant in its simplicity. I had trusted Maya because she wasn't my blood family. I thought that meant she was safe. I thought the eye rolls and the whispered jokes meant she saw what I saw. But she was Daniel's wife. She lived in his house. She slept in his bed. She was raising his children. When forced to choose between her husband's family and me, there was no choice at all. I thought about all the times she had seemed to be on my side, the smirks at holiday dinners, the whispered comments. Has any of it been genuine solidarity, or had it just been a way to gather information, a way to seem like an ally, while really being a spy I would never know? And it didn't matter anymore. I spent the rest of the evening updating my documentation. I wrote down everything I could remember from our cafe conversation, the questions she had asked, how she had steered the conversation toward my plans, how she had specifically asked about the lawyer and the documentation. At the time, it had seemed like a concern. Now it looked like an interrogation. I added my father's text about building a case. I noted the timing, 2 weeks between my conversation with Maya and the accusation from my father. Just enough time for the information to travel through Daniel to my parents and ferment into something toxic. The lesson was clear and brutal. Anything I said to anyone could and would be used against me. There were no safe people. There were no allies. There was only me and my documentation, and the truth that no one else seemed interested in hearing. Over the following weeks, I implemented a new policy: complete information quarantine. I answered questions with questions. I did nothing. If someone asked how I was doing, I said fine and changed the subject. If someone asked what I was planning, I said I hadn't decided. If someone tried to dig deeper, I suddenly had somewhere else to be. It was exhausting, this constant vigilance, but it was also clarifying. I started to see how much of my life had been spent managing other people's access to me, giving them what they wanted, explaining myself so they would understand, performing stability so they wouldn't worry. Now I have stopped performing. I let them wonder. The family narrative continued to evolve without my input. I heard through various channels that I was bitter, vindictive, possibly having some kind of breakdown. The story grew more elaborate with each retelling. Someone said I had threatened to sue. Someone else said I had demanded repayment for the mortgage. None of it was true, but none of it could be disproved. Stories don't require evidence. They just require repetition and the willingness to believe. I let them tell their story. I stopped trying to correct it. Every correction would become new material, new evidence of my instability, new proof that I was obsessed with being right. So I said nothing. I documented everything. I built my record of truth in silence, knowing that someday it might matter, knowing that someday someone might want to know what actually happened. For now, survival meant silence. But not the old silence, not the silence of accommodation and erasure. This was a new silence, chosen, controlled, strategic. I wasn't disappearing anymore. I was conserving my energy. I was protecting my truth. I was waiting. I didn't know what I was waiting for. I just knew that I couldn't be the only one who would ever see the situation clearly. Somewhere there had to be someone who would look at the facts without needing me to soften them. Someone who would stand with me, not because it benefited them, but because the truth mattered. That person wasn't Maya. It wasn't anyone in my family. But they had to exist somewhere. And until I found them, I would keep my own counsel. I would trust my own records. I would survive. I met Claire when I was 28 during my first year at the accounting firm. She was a senior associate 3 years ahead of me, known for being direct in a way that other women in the office avoided. She didn't soften her assessments or apologize before giving criticism. She didn't preface hard truths with, "I hope you don't mind me saying," or "This might be out of line, but." She just said what she thought and let the words stand on their own. It terrified most people. I found it refreshing. The first time we really talked was in the break room at 10 o'clock at night. We were both working late on the same client deadline, running on bad coffee and fluorescent lighting. She walked in, saw me staring at a spreadsheet that had stopped making sense hours ago, and said, "You've been looking at that same page for 20 minutes. Either take a break or admit you're stuck." Anyone else would have offered help gently with qualifications. Claire just stated the obvious and waited. I admitted I was stuck. She sat down, looked at my numbers, and found the error in about 90 seconds. Then she said, "You're good at this. You just need to learn when to step back and when to ask for help. Most people never figure that out." It was the first time anyone at the firm had told me I was good at anything, and she said it like a fact, not a compliment. That was Claire. She dealt in observations, not flattery. We became friends in the way working people do, slowly through accumulated interactions rather than deliberate bonding, late nights on shared projects, lunch runs when neither of us had time to actually sit down, brief conversations in the elevator about clients and deadlines and the particular absurdity of corporate life. She wasn't warm in the traditional sense. She didn't ask about my personal life or remember my birthday without a calendar reminder. But she was honest, and after a lifetime of navigating my family's careful fictions, honesty felt like oxygen. She left for a different firm when I was 31. Better title, better money, better work-life balance. The same month, my father called about the mortgage for the first time. Just a timing issue, just temporary. I set up the autopay and didn't tell anyone. By the time Claire and I met for coffee a few months later, I had already started disappearing into my new role as the family's invisible infrastructure. But Claire didn't know about any of that. She just knew the version of me that existed at work. Competent, capable, whole. We stayed in touch loosely after she left. Coffee once or twice a year, birthday texts, the occasional email when something reminded one of us of the other. She met someone, got married, and got divorced. I made a partner. She started her own consulting practice. Our lives diverged in the way adult lives do, but we maintained that particular kind of friendship that survives on accumulated history rather than constant contact. We had known each other during formative years, and that meant something even when months passed without a word. 3 months into my standoff with my parents, she texted me out of the blue. "In the city next week for client meetings. Lunch." I almost said no. I had trained myself not to see anyone who might ask questions. After Maya, I trusted no one with information about what was happening. But Claire had never met my family. She had no connection to them, no loyalty to them, no way for information to travel from her to them. She existed in a completely separate sphere of my life. And I was tired, so tired of carrying everything alone. We met at a restaurant in Midtown, one of those upscale lunch spots where business people talk too loudly about deals and mergers. Claire looked exactly the same as she always did. Sharp blazer, no-nonsense haircut, the expression of someone who had already sized up the room and decided most of it wasn't worth her time. "You look terrible," she said when I sat down. Classic Claire, no preamble. "Thanks, it's been a rough few months." "I can tell. You've lost weight. And not in a good way." She studied me for a moment the way she used to study spreadsheets. "You seem lighter, though, which is weird because you also seem exhausted. What's going on?" The question hung in the air. I had a choice. I could deflect the way I'd been deflecting everyone else. Say I was fine, change the subject, protect myself from another betrayal. Or I could take a risk on the one person who had never asked me to be anything other than what I was. Maybe it was because she wasn't connected to my family. Maybe it was because she'd never met them and never would. Maybe it was because she had always seen me clearly, even when I couldn't see myself. Maybe I was just exhausted from carrying it all alone and desperate for someone to share the weight. Whatever the reason, I told her everything. I started with dinner. The comment about Daniel being independent while I was broke. Then I went backward to the phone call 6 years earlier, the timing issue, the autopay I set up and never mentioned. I told her about the monthly transfers and the gradual rewriting of reality, about how Daniel became the responsible one while I became invisible, about the night I canceled the payment and the 100 phone calls that followed. I told her about my father showing up at my door, panicked and confused, about my mother's tears and guilt trips, about the conference call where everyone heard the numbers for the first time and retreated into their own comfortable versions of events. I told her about the aunts and cousins who suddenly reached out with concern about the narrative that I was having a breakdown about my mother showing up at my apartment to assess my mental state. I told her about Patricia the lawyer, about the documentation I was keeping, about Maya and the betrayal, about how the one person I thought might understand had taken my confidence and handed it directly to the people trying to undermine me. I told her all of it, every detail, every humiliation, every moment when I had questioned myself. And Claire listened without interrupting. No gasps of shock, no expressions of exaggerated sympathy, no, "Oh my God," or "That's horrible," or any of the performative reactions people offer when they want to seem supportive. Just focused, attentive silence, like she was absorbing data, organizing it, looking for patterns. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant noise continued around us, but our table felt like an island of stillness. "You know what's interesting?" she said finally. "You haven't once called them selfish or ungrateful. You haven't called them anything, actually. You keep saying they didn't understand, that they convinced themselves, that they let the story become what they wanted." I hadn't noticed that, but she was right. Even now, even after everything, I was still protecting them from my own anger. "I don't think they meant to hurt me," I said. "No," Claire agreed. "They probably didn't, but they also didn't mean to see you. And there's a difference between cruelty and erasure, but both do damage. Cruelty is active. It requires intention. Erasure is passive. It's just not seeing, not asking, not noticing. It's the assumption that you'll always be there doing what you do, asking for nothing. Cruelty leaves bruises. Erasure leaves holes." I felt something shift in my chest. She had named something I had been circling around for months without being able to articulate. "How do you know this?" I asked. She took a sip of her water before answering. "I spent 5 years with my ex-husband's family. They weren't bad people. They weren't cruel. But I was always the one who remembered birthdays, the one who organized holidays, the one who smoothed over arguments and kept the peace. And when I finally said I needed help, that I was exhausted, that someone else needed to step up for once, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. They didn't understand why I was upset. I had always done everything. That was just who I was, the capable one, the reliable one, the one who didn't need anything. What happened? I stopped. I stopped organizing things, stopped remembering things for everyone. And at first they were confused. Then they were annoyed. Then they rewrote the story. I became difficult. I became selfish. I was the one who had changed, who had abandoned my responsibilities. None of them ever considered that my responsibilities had never been fair in the first place. Did it get better? Not with them. It was one of the reasons the marriage ended. But it got better for me. I learned that I was allowed to have limits, that I wasn't obligated to be endlessly available just because I was capable of being endlessly available, that there's a difference between can and should. She leaned forward, her eyes holding mine with that characteristic intensity. "Whatever you decide to do," she said, "you're not wrong, not for stopping, not for stepping back, not for protecting yourself. These are your resources, your time, your money, your energy. You get to decide what to do with them, not your parents, not your brother, not the story your family wants to tell about itself. You." I felt tears threatening for the first time in weeks, not from sadness, from relief, from the sheer weight of being seen. "Thank you," I said. "For what? For not telling me to forgive them, or try harder, or be the bigger person." Claire made a sound that might have been a laugh. "You've been the bigger person for 6 years. You've been big enough for everyone. You've been so big that you've had to make yourself small just to fit into their version of reality. Maybe it's time to just be your own size." We sat with that for a moment. The restaurant noise filled the silence, but it didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt like a pause, not an ending. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "After you stopped doing everything for your ex's family, after the marriage ended, after all of it, did you ever regret stepping back? Did you ever wish you had just kept going, kept being the capable one, kept the peace?" Claire considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "There were moments," she admitted, "moments when I missed being needed, when I missed having a role, even if it was an unfair one. Being essential feels good even when it's exhausting, but I don't regret it. Because I learned something important. I learned that the people who only love you when you're useful don't actually love you. They love what you provide, and that's not the same thing." I thought about my father calling 100 times, never once asking why I stopped, only demanding that I start again. I thought about my mother's guilt trips, her careful reframing of sacrifice into obligation. I thought about Daniel's confusion, his genuine inability to understand that he had never contributed anything. They loved what I provided. They didn't miss me. They missed the role. "How did you know," I asked, "that you were doing the right thing?" I didn't. Not for a long time. I questioned myself constantly. Was I being selfish? Was I overreacting? Was I destroying my marriage over something petty? It took years before I could look back and see clearly. But here's what helped. I found one person who saw the situation for what it was. One person outside the system who could look at the facts without needing me to soften them. Who could say, yes, that's unfair. Yes, you deserve better. No, you're not crazy. That person was my therapist, but it could have been anyone. The point was having one witness to reality, one person who saw. She reached across the table and touched my hand briefly, the most physical affection I had ever seen from her. Now you have one too. After lunch, I walked back to my office through Midtown Manhattan, moving with the crowd, but feeling separate from it. The city noise felt muted, like I was wrapped in something protective. Something had shifted, something fundamental. For weeks I had been questioning myself. Every day brought new doubts. Was I being cruel? Was I overreacting? Should I find a way to smooth things over? The voice of my family lived in my head, telling me I was wrong, telling me I was selfish, telling me I was destroying everything over one dinner comment. And part of me had believed that voice because it had been the only voice I'd heard for so long. But now, there was another voice, Claire's voice. Calm, direct, honest, saying what no one in my family had ever said. You're not wrong. You get to decide. Be your own size. She hadn't told me what to do. She hadn't given me a plan or a strategy or advice I hadn't asked for. She had simply acknowledged reality. And that acknowledgement was enough to quiet the constant second-guessing that had been buzzing in my head since this started. Not silent entirely, but quiet it enough that I could hear my own thoughts again. I stopped walking in the middle of the sidewalk, and people flowed around me like water around a stone. I stood there for a moment, breathing, feeling the strange sensation of taking up space without apologizing for it. When you spend years in a system that denies your reality, having one person see it clearly changes everything. I didn't need everyone to understand. I didn't need my family to apologize or admit they were wrong. I didn't need Maya to take back her betrayal or my aunt to stop calling people about my mental state. I just needed one person outside the system to confirm that what I was experiencing was real, that I wasn't crazy, that my perception of events wasn't distorted by bitterness or ingratitude or whatever other failing they wanted to assign to me. I had that now. One witness, one person who saw. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. I started walking again, joining the flow of people moving through the city, but I wasn't moving the same way I had before. I wasn't minimizing. I wasn't apologizing. I wasn't making myself small to accommodate the space around me. For the first time in months, maybe in years, I was just walking, existing, taking up exactly as much space as I needed, being my own size. The job offer came from Chicago, a senior position at a growing firm. Less money than I was making, but better work-life balance and the kind of clients I actually wanted to work with. I had applied months earlier almost as a hypothetical. What would it look like to start over? Now the offer was real, and the hypothetical demanded an answer. I ran the numbers. The salary cut was about 15%, but Chicago's cost of living was lower than New York's. My rent would drop. My commute would disappear. Factoring everything in, I would end up roughly even, maybe even slightly ahead. But the real math was different. New York meant being 40 minutes from my parents' house. It meant being available for unannounced visits and emergency calls and family gatherings, where I would be expected to perform my designated role. Chicago meant 800 miles. It meant plane tickets were required. It meant no one could show up at my door without warning. I accepted the offer. The logistics of relocating consumed the next several weeks. Finding an apartment remotely, scrolling through listings late at night, trying to imagine myself in spaces I'd never seen. Coordinating the move, getting quotes from companies scheduling pickups and deliveries. Transitioning my clients, explaining to each one that I was leaving, but that they'd be in good hands. The busier I stayed, the less I had to think about what I was actually doing. I told Claire first. We met for dinner at a place in the village we'd been meaning to try for years, but never got around to. When I told her about Chicago, she didn't look surprised. I figured something was coming, she said. You've had that look. What look? The look of someone who's already gone. You've been here physically, but your mind left weeks ago. She wasn't wrong. I had been mentally packing for longer than I'd admitted to myself. Are you okay with this? I asked. I feel like I'm abandoning you. Claire laughed that sharp sound I'd come to love. You're not abandoning me. You're saving yourself. There's a difference. Besides, I'll visit. Chicago has good restaurants. And bad weather. I'll bring a coat. We finished dinner and walked through the village one last time together. She hugged me at the corner where we usually parted ways longer than she'd ever hugged me before. You're doing the right thing, she said. Don't let anyone make you feel guilty for choosing yourself. I told my colleagues at work, my friends in the city, and my landlord. The only people I didn't tell were my family. Packing was harder than I expected. Not the physical labor, but the decisions. Every object required a choice. Keep or leave. Take or donate. Remember or forget. I found a box in the back of my closet I hadn't opened in years. Inside were things I'd saved from my childhood. Report cards. A few photos. A Christmas ornament my mother had given me when I was 12. A small glass angel she'd said reminded her of me. Quiet and delicate. I held the ornament for a long time, turning it in my hands, watching the light catch its edges. I thought about the woman who had given it to me, the woman who had shown up at my apartment to check if I was mentally stable, the woman who had never once asked how I was really doing during 6 years of silent support. I wrapped the angel carefully in newspaper and placed it back in the box. Then I taped the box shut and wrote "Donate" on the side in black marker. Some things aren't worth carrying 800 miles. My family found out eventually. I don't know how. Probably through one of their surveillance networks, the relatives and acquaintances who fed information back to the center. My mother called 3 days before I was scheduled to move. You're leaving. I got a job in Chicago. When were you going to tell us? I didn't think you'd care. Of course we care. You're our daughter. I've been your daughter for 37 years. For 6 of those years, I paid your mortgage. How many times did you call to check on me during those 6 years? Not about money, about me. She didn't answer. I have to go. The movers are coming. I hung up before she could respond. It was easier than I expected. The night before I left, I walked through my empty apartment. Everything I owned was in boxes or already on a truck. The walls were bare. The closets were hollow. It looked like a place where someone used to live. I stood in the kitchen where I'd made coffee every morning for 5 years. I walked through the living room where I'd sat on my couch staring at my phone, watching my father's name appear again and again. I looked out the window at the view I'd memorized, without meaning, to the brick building across the street, the sliver of sky between rooftops. This apartment had been my sanctuary during the hardest months of my life. It had also been my cage close enough to my family that they could reach me whenever they wanted. I was grateful to leave it. I was sad to leave it. Both things were true. My phone buzzed. My father's name is on the screen. I let it go to voicemail. His message was different from the ones before, quieter, almost hesitant. I don't know what happened to us. I don't know how we got here. I just want you to know that we love you, even if it doesn't seem like it. I saved the voicemail, not because I was moved by it, because it was evidence. Evidence that even now at the end, he couldn't say the words that mattered. Not, "I'm sorry we took you for granted." Not, "Thank you for everything you did." Just, "We love you," as if love were enough. As if love without recognition weren't just another form of erasure. The next morning, I loaded the last of my bags into my car. The sun was barely up the street, still quiet. I took one last look at the building I'd called home at the window that had been mine at the life I was leaving behind. Then I got in the car and drove west. I didn't look back. Chicago was colder than I expected. Not just the weather, the city itself. New York had been overwhelming, but it was familiar. I knew how to navigate it, how to find the corners that felt like mine. Chicago was a stranger. I told myself this was good. Strangers don't expect anything from you. They take you at face value, unencumbered by history or story. I found an apartment in Lincoln Park, a third-floor walk-up with big windows, and no family memories attached to any corner. I furnished it slowly, deliberately choosing things because I liked them, rather than because they matched what I'd inherited or been given. Every choice was mine. Every object was chosen. The new job was demanding in the way all new jobs are: new systems to learn, new relationships to build, new rhythms to establish. I threw myself into it with something approaching gratitude. Work was quantifiable. Effort led to outcomes. There was no invisible labor, no unacknowledged contributions, just tasks and deadlines and measurable results. Weeks passed without crisis, and that alone told me I'd made the right move. For 3 months, I maintained minimal contact with my family. A text to my mother on her birthday, a brief call with Daniel when he reached out about a tax question. Nothing substantive, nothing that could become material. Then Daniel called with news. Mom and Dad are selling the house. I was standing in my new kitchen cooking dinner. I set down the spatula and moved to the window. Okay, they can't keep up with the payments. They tried to refinance, but their credit... Anyway, they're selling. I'm sorry to hear that. The thing is, they're going to come up short. After paying off the mortgage and the liens, they might break even. Maybe not even that. That's unfortunate. I was wondering if maybe you could help, just for the transition, a bridge loan or something until they get settled. I looked out at the Chicago skyline. Lake Michigan was invisible in the dark, but I knew it was there. No, it would just be temporary, like the $3,000 a month was temporary. That's not fair, isn't it? I gave them 6 years. I gave them over $200,000. They repaid me by calling me broke at dinner and telling everyone I was having a mental breakdown. Now they need help again and you're calling me. Not offering anything yourself, just asking me to fix it. I don't have that kind of money. I know. You never did. And yet somehow you were the independent one. He exhaled slowly, like someone realizing the math had finally caught up to him. He didn't have a response to that. After a long silence, he said, "So, that's it. You're just going to let them struggle. I'm going to let them experience the consequences of their choices. That's different from letting them struggle. I carried the consequences for 6 years. Now it's their turn. They're your parents. And I was their daughter. For 6 years, that meant financing their life without a word of thanks. I'm done." I hung up. My dinner was cold. I didn't care. I sat on my couch and stared at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the conversation settle. He would tell them I refused. They would add it to the story, the ungrateful daughter, the bitter child who abandoned her family. Let them. I was 800 miles away. Their story didn't reach me here. 2 months later, the house was sold. My mother sent me a text. We found an apartment in Edison. Smaller, but it will do. No accusation. No guilt trip. Just information. I texted back, "I hope you'll be comfortable there." And I meant it. I didn't wish them suffering. I just wasn't willing to prevent it at my own expense anymore. There's a difference between wanting someone to hurt and refusing to hurt yourself to save them. The house I grew up in, the mortgage I paid for 6 years, the dining room where my father called me broke while I was funding his life. Gone. Sold to strangers who would fill it with their own stories. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt free, not relieved, not victorious, just free. Freedom is heavier than I expected. When you're trapped in a system, you dream about escape. You imagine how light you'll feel when the weight is lifted. But then the weight is gone, and you realize you don't know how to stand without it. For months, I had been defined by opposition. I was the one who stopped paying, the one who walked away, the one who refused. Now settled in Chicago with no more battles to fight, I had to figure out who I was beyond what I had rejected. The days had a strange emptiness to them. I went to work. I came home. I cooked dinner. I read books. I went to bed. The absence of the crisis was peaceful, but also disorienting. I had spent so much energy on vigilance that I didn't know what to do with a mind that wasn't constantly scanning for threats. I started therapy, not because I was falling apart, but because I didn't know how to build something new. My therapist was a practical woman named Dr. Rivera, who didn't waste time on sympathy. "Tell me about your family," she said in our first session. I gave her the short version, the mortgage payments, the lack of acknowledgement, the dinner comment, the aftermath. "And how do you feel about them now?" "I don't know," distant, relieved, sometimes angry, but not as often as I used to be. Do you want to reconcile? I don't know what that would look like. They've never apologized. They've never acknowledged what happened. If I reconcile without that, I'm just stepping back into the same dynamic. And if they did apologize, if they did acknowledge it. I thought about that for a long time. I still don't think I'd want to go back to how things were. Even if they understood what they did, I'm not the same person anymore. I don't want to be the quiet one who handles things. I don't want to be invisible. Then reconciliation would require them to see a person they've never seen before. Yes. Do you think they're capable of that? I didn't have an answer. The months passed. I made friends at work. I found a coffee shop I liked. I discovered neighborhoods that felt like mine. Chicago slowly stopped being a stranger and started being home. My contact with my family dwindled to near nothing. A text at holidays, a brief call on birthdays. Nothing substantive, nothing that reopened old wounds. I didn't miss them exactly. I missed the idea of them. The family I wished I'd had, the parents who saw me clearly and loved me for who I actually was. The brother who admired me instead of competing with me. That family had never existed except in my imagination. The real family, the one I'd actually grown up in, had required my invisibility to function. Missing them would mean missing my own erasure. And I couldn't do that anymore. One evening, almost a year after I'd moved, I got an email from my mother. It was longer than her usual communications. I've been thinking about what happened. I know we hurt you. I didn't understand how much until you were gone. Your father doesn't like to talk about it, but I can tell he feels it too. The house is quiet now, not just because we moved, because you're not part of our lives anymore. I'm not asking you to come back or forgive us. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what you did for us. I see that we didn't see you. I'm sorry it took losing you to understand that. I read the email 3 times. Then I closed my laptop and went for a walk. The lake was dark and endless. The city glittered behind me. I thought about what my mother had written and what she hadn't written. She was sorry. That was something. But she was sorry because I was gone, not because of what she'd done. The loss mattered more than the cause. The consequence prompted reflection, not the injustice itself. It wasn't enough, not for reconciliation, not for reopening doors I'd closed for good reasons. But it was something. A crack in the wall. Evidence that reality had penetrated, however slightly. I walked until my feet were tired, then went home and wrote back. Thank you for saying that. I needed to hear it. I'm not ready to come back into the family the way things were. Maybe someday we can build something different. But it would have to be different. I can't be invisible again. I sent it and went to bed. Whatever happened next, I had said what I needed to say. The rest was up to them. Forgiveness is not a feeling. It's not a warm glow of reconciliation or a moment of tearful understanding. It's not the scene in movies where everyone cries and hugs and promises to do better. It's not closure, whatever that word even means. Forgiveness is a decision, a choice about what to carry forward and what to set down. And like most important decisions, it doesn't announce itself. It arrives quietly, almost accidentally, on an ordinary day when you're not paying attention. I realized I had forgiven my parents on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring, about 18 months after I moved to Chicago. I was sitting in my apartment paying bills online when I noticed that I wasn't angry anymore. Not that the anger had been replaced by warmth or understanding, it had just faded, like a bruise that you stop noticing until one day you look down and realize it's gone. I forgave them, not because they earned it, not because they apologized enough or changed enough or made amends. They hadn't done any of those things. My father still hadn't spoken to me directly since I left. My mother's communications remained careful and superficial, never acknowledging what had happened, never taking responsibility. Daniel continued to exist in his own reality where his independence was still somehow intact. I forgave them because holding on to anger was costing me more than it was costing them. The resentment I carried was mine to feel every day. It lived in my body, in my clenched jaw, and my tight shoulders and my racing thoughts at 3 a.m. They only encountered my anger when I chose to express it, which meant that refusing to forgive was a punishment I mostly inflicted on myself. They were living their lives in New Jersey, telling their story, believing their version of events. My rage didn't touch them. It only touched me. Dr. Rivera, my therapist, had been gently pointing this out for months. "Forgiveness isn't about them," she said once. "It's not a gift you give to someone who hurt you. It's a weight you put down because you're tired of carrying it." I had resisted this idea at first. It felt like letting them off the hook, like saying what they did was okay, like betraying myself by releasing the righteous anger that had fueled my escape. But holding on to anger requires energy, enormous amounts of energy. Energy I could have been spending on my new life, my new friends, my new sense of self. Instead, I was spending it on people who weren't even in the room. I was giving them space in my head that they hadn't earned and didn't deserve. So I put the anger down, not all at once, gradually over months, like lowering a heavy bag to the ground 1 inch at a time. And somewhere in that process, without quite meaning to, I forgave them. But forgiveness didn't mean what I thought it would mean. It didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean restored trust. It didn't mean pretending the past hadn't happened or rewriting my own history to make them look better. Forgiveness meant accepting that they were who they were. It meant releasing the hope that they would transform into the parents I wished I'd had. It meant grieving the family I never actually had instead of keeping myself in pain, waiting for them to become it. I could forgive them and still not want them in my life. Those two things weren't contradictory. Forgiveness meant I wished them well. Boundaries meant I wished them well from a distance. My mother's email, the one she'd sent almost a year after I left, had opened a door. She had acknowledged, however partially, that she hadn't seen me, that she was sorry it took losing me to understand. It wasn't a complete apology. It wasn't accountability. But it was something. A crack in the wall, evidence that reality had penetrated, however slightly. I had written back thanking her for saying it, telling her I wasn't ready to return to the family the way things were. Maybe someday we could build something different. But it would have to be different. I couldn't be invisible again. Since then, we have exchanged messages occasionally, superficial updates, photos of her garden, brief notes about the weather or local news, careful neutrality. She didn't push for more, which I appreciated. Maybe she understood finally that pushing would only push me further away. Or maybe she was simply tired too. Either way, the distance remained, but it was a peaceful distance now. Not a war zone. Just space. My father never wrote, never called. Not once in the 18 months since I'd moved. Pride, probably. Or shame. Or the particular masculine inability to admit wrongdoing that I had watched him display my entire life. He was a man who had never apologized for anything, who experienced any acknowledgement of fault as a fundamental threat to his identity. I accepted that I might never hear an apology from him. I made peace with that absence. It hurts sometimes. Late at night, when my guard was down, I would feel the absence of a father who could say he was sorry, who could see what he had done and take responsibility for it. But then I would remind myself that I had never actually had that father. The one I was grieving was a fantasy. The real one, the one who existed, was incapable of that kind of reflection. Grieving his absence was like grieving a character in a book I had wanted to be real. Daniel reached out once about a year after I'd moved. His name on my phone screen still triggered a complicated mix of emotions, but I answered. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I was testing myself. "Hey," he said, "how's Chicago?" "It's good. Cold, but good." "Listen, I wanted to talk to you about something. An opportunity." Of course, he wasn't calling to reconnect. He wasn't calling to apologize or understand or make amends. He was calling because he wanted something. "I'm opening a gallery space with some partners, art and photography. We've got a great location lined up in Jersey City, and the vision is really solid. I wanted to know if you'd consider investing." I almost laughed. The audacity was almost impressive. "Tell me about the business plan," I said, keeping my voice neutral. He launched into an explanation that was heavy on vision and light on specifics. The financials were optimistic, to put it generously. The revenue projections assumed a level of foot traffic that bore no relationship to reality. The partnership structure was vague. It looked exactly like every other Daniel scheme I had seen over the years: big dreams, no substance, and someone else's money to cushion the inevitable fall. "I can't help with this," I said when he finished. "Why not?" "You haven't even thought about it." "I have thought about it. I thought about it while you were talking. The numbers don't work, Daniel. The projections are unrealistic. You don't have enough capital for the build-out, and your timeline is way too aggressive. You're being negative. You always do this. I'm being accurate. There's a difference. I'm not asking for a lot, just enough to show the other investors I have family support. It would really help if I could tell them my sister believes in the project. But I don't believe in the project, and I'm not going to pretend I do so you can use my credibility to raise money from other people." His voice shifted, hardening. "So that's it. You won't even consider it?" "My money isn't available for your projects. It hasn't been for a long time." "You have money. You just don't want to share it." "That's correct. I worked hard for what I have. I took risks you wouldn't take. I made sacrifices you weren't willing to make, and now I choose how to use it. I'm choosing not to use it for this." "You've changed." "Yes, I have." There was a long silence. I could hear him breathing, trying to figure out a new angle. Finally, he said, "Is this still about the mortgage thing? Because that was years ago. I didn't even know what was happening." "It's not about the mortgage. It's about the fact that you're calling me for the first time in a year, and it's not to ask how I am, or to apologize, or to rebuild our relationship. It's to ask for money. That tells me everything I need to know about where we stand. That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's true." I hung up. My hands were shaking slightly, but not from anger, from the effort of holding my ground, from the unfamiliarity of saying no without apologizing for it. The gallery never opened. The partnership dissolved 3 months later. Daniel moved on to his next idea, something about a podcast network. Some things never change. Some people never change. I had made peace with that too. I built my life in Chicago. I made friends who knew nothing about my history, developed routines that belonged only to me. Saturday morning yoga, Sunday brunch at the cafe 3 blocks from my apartment, Wednesday evening calls with Claire, who had become something like a sister to me, or at least what I imagined a sister could be. The freedom I'd found after leaving wasn't a destination. It was an ongoing process. Every day I chose who to be and what to carry. Some days I made good choices. Some days I fell back into old patterns, apologizing too much, making myself small, absorbing other people's emotions as if they were my responsibility. But I notice now, I caught myself. That was the difference. I was awake to my own patterns in a way I had never been before. Some days I missed having a family. Not my family, but a family. The idea of people who knew you from the beginning and loved you anyway. The idea of a home you could return to, a table where your seat was always waiting. I grieved that absence sometimes. The grief would hit me unexpectedly at holidays, at milestone moments, at random times when I saw families together and felt the ache of something I didn't have. Then I would remind myself that what I'd had wasn't that anyway. What I'd had was a role in a play that didn't serve me, a seat at a table where no one saw me, a home where I was a function, not a person. Leaving wasn't losing something precious. It was releasing something harmful. The grief was for the fantasy, not the reality. Once I understood that, it became easier to bear. 2 years after I moved to Chicago, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. New Jersey area code. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. "Is this Margaret Sullivan?" A woman's voice, professional and careful. "Yes. This is the nurse coordinator at St. Peter's Hospital in New Brunswick. Your father, Robert Sullivan, was admitted this afternoon. He's had a cardiac event, a heart attack. He's stable now, but he's going to need surgery. We found your number listed as an emergency contact." I stood in my kitchen, frozen. My father. Heart attack. Surgery. The words didn't quite connect to reality. "When?" I managed. "He came in around 2 this afternoon. The surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. Your mother is here. She asked us to call you." She asked us to call. She hadn't called herself. That said something, though I wasn't sure what. "I'll be there," I said. "I'm coming from Chicago, so it will take me a few hours to arrange a flight." "Of course. We'll let your mother know." I hung up and stood in my kitchen looking at my phone, trying to process what had just happened. My father was in the hospital. My father might die. The man who had laughed at me at dinner, who had called me broke, who hadn't spoken to me in 2 years, might not survive the week. I should have felt something more, something clearer, but the emotions were layered and contradictory. Fear, grief, anger, relief, guilt about the relief, the same complicated mess that had characterized my relationship with him my entire life. I booked a flight for that evening. I packed a small bag. I texted Claire. Dad had a heart attack, flying home. She responded immediately. "Do you need me to come with you?" I said no, but the offer meant everything. The flight was 3 hours of suspended reality. I sat in my window seat watching the clouds pass beneath us, thinking about what I would say when I saw him, what I would say when I saw any of them. I hadn't been back to New Jersey since I left. I hadn't seen my mother's face or walked the streets of my childhood. Everything I had built in Chicago felt fragile suddenly, like it might collapse the moment I stepped back into that old world. I landed at Newark at 11:30 at night and took a cab directly to the hospital. The building was quieter than I expected, the hallways hushed in that particular way hospitals are after visiting hours. I found my mother in a waiting room on the cardiac floor. She looked older than I remembered. Smaller, the lines on her face had deepened and her hair had gone grayer. "You came," she said when she saw me. Her voice cracked slightly. "Of course I came." We didn't hug. We weren't a hugging family. But we sat down together on the uncomfortable hospital chairs, and for a while, neither of us said anything. "How is he?" I asked finally. "Stable. They're doing the surgery in the morning. A bypass. The doctor said it's serious, but they're optimistic." I nodded. "What happened?" she told me. He'd been in the yard doing something with the garden when the pain started. He'd almost dismissed it, thought it was indigestion. But it got worse, and finally, he let her call an ambulance. By the time they got to the hospital, part of his heart had been damaged. Not irreversibly, but significantly. "He's been asking about you," she said quietly. "He has, not out loud, but I can tell. Every time someone comes in the room, he looks toward the door." I didn't know what to say to that. I sat with the information, turning it over in my mind like a stone. Daniel arrived about an hour later. He looked exhausted and scared. For once, he didn't seem interested in performing. He nodded at me, sat down across from us, and stared at the floor. We were all silent. 3 people who didn't know how to be a family sitting together in a hospital waiting room, united by nothing but genetics and crisis. The surgery the next morning lasted 4 hours. We sat in the same waiting room, drinking bad coffee, not talking about anything that mattered. At one point, Daniel went to get food. My mother fell asleep in her chair. I sat alone watching the clock, thinking about all the things I might never get to say. When the surgeon finally came out, her expression was cautiously positive. The procedure had gone well. He would need significant recovery time, lifestyle changes, medication, but he would likely survive. My mother cried. Daniel hugged her. I stood slightly apart, feeling the relief, but not quite able to join the celebration. Survival was good, but survival didn't mean resolution. It didn't mean understanding. It just meant more time. And I wasn't sure what to do with that. They let us see him that afternoon, one at a time. My mother went first, then Daniel. When it was my turn, I walked into the room, slowly bracing myself for I didn't know what. He looked small in the hospital bed. The machines beeped and hummed around him. His skin was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The man who had always seemed so large, so certain, so immovable, looked fragile and old. His eyes opened when I approached. They focused on me, and I saw something in them I hadn't expected. Something that might have been surprising, or might have been gratitude. "You came," he said. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Yes." I didn't think you would. I sat down in the chair beside his bed. Neither did I. We looked at each other for a long moment. 2 years of silence hung between us, filled with everything we hadn't said and probably never would. I'm glad you're okay, I said finally. Or that you will be. He nodded slightly. They say I need to change some things. Diet, exercise, stress. He made a sound that might have been a laugh. The doctor says I need to learn to relax. That's probably good advice. Another silence. I could feel him wanting to say something more, fighting with himself. I watched the struggle play out across his face. I know he started, then stopped, took a breath. Things haven't been... He couldn't finish, couldn't find the words, or couldn't bring himself to say them. After a lifetime of never apologizing, the habit was too strong, even here, even now. It's okay, I said, and I meant it. Not that what happened was okay, but I wasn't waiting for the apology anymore. I wasn't holding my breath for words he might never be able to say. You should rest, I told him. I'll be here. I sat with him until he fell asleep. Then I went back to the waiting room and told my mother I was going to find a hotel. I needed space. I needed air. I needed to be somewhere that didn't smell like antiseptic and complicated history. I spent 3 days in New Jersey. I went to the hospital every morning, sat with my mother, talked to doctors, and helped with logistics. I didn't stay at their new apartment. I couldn't face that. I stayed at a hotel near the hospital and maintained a careful distance that was both physical and emotional. Daniel and I didn't talk much. There wasn't hostility exactly, just nothing to say. We existed in parallel, both there for the same person, both unable to bridge the gap between us. On my last day before I left for the airport, I went to see my father one more time. He was sitting up now, looking better, more color in his face, more like himself. You're leaving, he asked when I told him. I have to get back. Work. He nodded. Chicago. Yes. Another pause. Then he said, take care of yourself. It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology or an acknowledgement or anything close to what I had once needed from him, but it was something, a crack in the armor, a moment of something that might have been connection. You too, I said. Listen to the doctors. I'll try. I left. I flew back to Chicago. I resumed my life. The visit didn't change anything fundamental. My father didn't transform into a different person. My mother didn't suddenly develop the ability to acknowledge the past. Daniel didn't become self-aware or responsible. We didn't have a tearful reconciliation or resolve years of pain. We just existed in the same space for 3 days, and then I went home. But it proved something to myself, something important. I could be in their presence without losing myself. I could care about them without disappearing into their needs. I could show up for a crisis without signing up for a lifetime of invisibility. Those were different things, and I had finally learned to tell them apart. Forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. Presence doesn't require absolution. I could love them in my complicated way and still choose not to be hurt by them anymore. I flew back to Chicago and walked into my apartment, which felt more like home than anywhere in New Jersey ever had. I unpacked my bag, watered my plants, and checked my email. I texted Claire back, "He's going to be okay. I'm going to be okay too." She responded, "Proud of you." And I was proud of myself, not for going back, not for being the bigger person or forgiving or any of that. I was proud because I had done something hard without losing myself in the process. I had been present without being consumed. I had cared without disappearing. That was a kind of freedom too, maybe the most important kind. Nothing was wrong this morning. For the first time in years, that fact didn't make me brace for impact. I woke up in my apartment in Chicago, sun streaming through the windows I'd chosen specifically for their eastern exposure. I made coffee in the kitchen I'd designed to my taste. I sat in the chair I'd bought because it was comfortable, not because it matched anyone else's expectations. The silence in my apartment was comfortable now, not pregnant with anticipated demands, not heavy with obligations waiting to surface, just quiet. Mine. It was Sunday, which meant brunch with Rachel and Diane. We'd been meeting at the same cafe in Lincoln Park for almost 2 years now, ever since Rachel overheard me ordering at the counter and said, "Finally, someone else who asks for extra foam without apologizing for it." We'd been friends ever since. I arrived first, claimed our usual table by the window, and watched the street wake up. When Rachel and Diane walked in laughing about something that had happened at Diane's office, I felt a warmth I still wasn't entirely used to. These were people who knew me, not the role I played in someone else's story, just me. "You look good," Rachel said as she sat down. "Rested." "I slept 9 hours," I said, on purpose, without feeling guilty about it. "Progress," Diane said, raising her coffee cup in a mock toast. It was a small thing, sleeping without guilt. But small things were how I measured my life now. The ability to say no without explaining. The ability to spend money on myself without calculating how much someone else might need it. The ability to have a Sunday morning that belonged entirely to me. I thought about the person I used to be, the one who paid her parents' mortgage for 6 years without acknowledgement, the one who absorbed insults with a smile, the one who cleared dishes while her brother held court, the one who was so committed to being easy that she nearly disappeared entirely. That woman wasn't weak. She was surviving. She was doing what the system rewarded. She kept things running the only way she knew how. I don't judge her. I understand why she made the choices she made. But I'm not her anymore. The change wasn't dramatic or triumphant. It was gradual. Daily choices that accumulated into a different life. Saying no when I meant no. Asking for what I needed instead of assuming I didn't deserve to need anything. Taking up space instead of minimizing my presence. My family still exists. They still tell their version of events. I know because stories have a way of circulating. In their telling, I'm the one who abandoned them, the ungrateful daughter, the bitter sister. I've made peace with that narrative. Controlling other people's stories was never possible anyway. All I can control is my own. Here's what my story says: I gave too much for too long to people who didn't see me. I stopped. I left. I built something new. I'm not a victim, and I'm not a villain. I'm someone who learned the hard way that love without recognition isn't love. It's infrastructure. I keep in touch with my mother occasionally. Surface-level exchanges, holiday greetings, updates that reveal nothing vulnerable. It's not the relationship I once wanted, but it's the relationship that's possible with the people they actually are not the people I wished they were. My father and I don't speak. His heart surgery was 2 years ago. He recovered. We exchanged a few words at the hospital, and that was it. Sometimes I wonder if he thinks about what happened, if he understands now what I did for them. I'll probably never know, and I've accepted that. Daniel sends occasional texts, updates about his latest ventures, photos of his kids. I respond politely but don't engage deeply. Maya and I never spoke again after she betrayed my confidence. Some breaks aren't worth mending. The money I spent on them, the $216,000 over 6 years, sometimes I think about what I could have done with it. A down payment on a house, investments that would have compounded, travel, security. The calculations are painful if I let myself dwell on them. But I don't dwell. The money is gone. The lesson was expensive. But I learned something that money couldn't buy. I learned my own worth. I know now that I'm allowed to take up space, that my needs are valid, that helping people who don't see me isn't generosity. It's self-erasure. I know that silence can be protection, but it can also be a prison. I know that family is supposed to be the people who see you most clearly, but sometimes they're the people who see you least. I know that leaving isn't abandonment when staying means disappearing. The woman I am now has boundaries, not walls, boundaries. I can be generous without being a resource. I can care without being consumed. I can show up for emergencies without signing up for a lifetime of invisibility. I have friends who know me, colleagues who respect me, a life that belongs entirely to me. None of it came from dramatic confrontation or decisive revenge. It came from quiet daily choices, from showing up for myself the way I used to show up for everyone else. The last time I visited New Jersey, I drove past my parents' old house. The new owners had painted it a different color, changed the landscaping, made it theirs. The dining room where my father called me broke is someone else's dining room now. Whatever ghosts I left there belong to the past. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt clear. That's what freedom feels like, I've learned. Not happiness necessarily, not the absence of pain, just clarity. Knowing who you are, knowing what you'll accept, knowing what you're worth. They still tell their story. I don't live in it anymore. I didn't win against them. I won my life back, and that's enough.